So Asian America is a very diverse diaspora of immigrants and Asians generally, with communities big and small across America. Here in the Silicon Valley, where I think most of us are located, we are in one of the most concentrated Asian American pockets. While we may be connected to our roots through family and remembering tradition and connecting with others who share our Asian backgrounds, our roots, it's still important to also learn about Asian American history and where current stereotypes come from. This presentation will be providing context into the historical and current experiences of Asians in America. Today, Nicole, Sonia, and Alice will be sharing. If you have any questions, please share them in the chat, which we will try to answer at the end in a 30-minute question and answer session.
This presentation is given by BayEcho, which is an open, safe environment for local high schoolers from the Silicon Valley to articulate thoughts on social issues relevant to teenagers and parents in our community. We present unshared findings and personal anecdotes to fuel lasting understanding and ultimately strengthen family bonds. I'm Nicole, and I'm a junior from the Harker School.
I'm Sonia, and I'm a junior at Gong High School.
I'm Alice, and I'm a junior at the Harker School.
First, we'll be talking about Asian American history. And the goal of learning about Asian American history is to get a deeper understanding of how Asian American identity has developed to reflect our status today and to understand the historical background behind the recent rise in anti-Asian American hate incidents. So first, following the discovery of gold in California, Chinese miners headed to California seeking riches, with 25,000 arriving by 1851. Facing uncertain work opportunities and hostile locals, on top of a language barrier, many Chinese laborers took dangerous work for little pay, such as building the Transcontinental Railroad. Around the same time, the growth of the sugar industry with the development of the relationship between the US and Hawaii led to a demand for labor, which was fulfilled by laborers from different Asian nations, such as the Philippines and Japan. From the beginning, a Pan-Asian alliance was difficult due to working conditions. For example, the California Department of Industrial Relations noted that using laborers who spoke different languages could prevent them from forming bonds and striking together. As more Asian Americans arrived, there was an increase in anti-immigration sentiment. And immigrants sometimes faced hostile or violent treatment from locals, such as in the Chinese massacre of 1871 in LA. Exclusion policies to regulate immigrants also began to be put into place, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was signed by President Chester A. Arthur. And it prohibited Chinese workers from immigrating to the US and banned them from American citizenship. So next, looking more at exclusion policies and how they led to divisions among Asian Americans. So between the mid-19th and early 20th centuries, over 1 million Asian people immigrated to the United States. However, the Asian American population remained internally divided by location and nationality. And in addition to the desire to maintain distinct ethnic identities, conflicts in East Asia also limited cooperative efforts among Asian Americans in the country. For example, during the Sino-Japanese War in 1937, the acceptance of Chinese Americans in America became more likely due to the Sino-American alliance against Japan and public sympathy toward the Chinese. And looking at this image on the right, it's of an article published in Life magazine in 1941 with the title How to Tell the Japanese from the Chinese, which relies on supposed distinctions in physical appearance to generate terror over this concept of a Japanese enemy, which reconciled the Chinese Americans and the American public. And by designating who were the good Asians and who were the bad Asians, US exclusion policies divided Asian American communities. So by 1968, Asian immigrants and their descendants had been in the United States for over a century, And the social distance that had previously limited Asian Americans was now evaporating as the new generation of young Asian Americans arrived on college campuses. Asian American students had the ability to communicate through English, and they began by shaping advocacy through advocating against the Vietnam War. With the onset of the Vietnam War and anger at American intervention in Asia, they broke down national barriers to build a student anti-war movement. Some examples of this are Berkeley student activists Yuji Ishioka and Emma G, who founded the Asian American Political Alliance at Berkeley in 1968, which was one of the first political organizations for Asian Americans. And they defied the traditional standard of assimilation by creating a self-determined definition of Asian American. And Ichioka actually created the term Asian American in opposition to the previous label of Oriental. At the end of the Vietnam War, Pan-Asian groups developed more cultural programming as their political mission came to a close. However, the impacts of the Asian American movement in the 60s and 70s still last into the 21st century, such as college coalitions for Asian Americans. While seemingly historically remote from the days of Vietnam War protests, Asian American student groups began during that period of advocacy. So next, the assumption that ethnic minorities don't fit the definition of what it means to be American might manifest in incidents such as questioning where an individual is from, complimenting their command of English, or mistaking them as a foreigner. These behaviors are called racial microaggressions, which might convey some messages of exclusion or inferiority. If minority groups are cognizant that they're denied the American identity, there might be the awareness of being perceived as a foreigner might account for reports of conflict between ethnic and national identities. And if minorities are excluded from the national identity and reminded that they don't typify what it means to be American, they might experience some degree of internal conflict. In the case of the perpetual foreigner stereotype, which is often used to describe Asian American identity, individuals whose American identity is often called into question might conclude that are not perceived as being as American as European Americans. Thus, one's awareness of being perceived by others as a foreigner would result in a sense of conflict between ethnic and national identities. The conflation of one's identity with the country that they immigrated from can be seen in a historical pattern, with events such as the Sino-American Alliance during World War II that I previously talked about, and Japanese internment or Japanese incarceration camps, when thousands of Japanese Americans on the West Coast were transported to camps in desert areas during World War II without proof that they were assisting the Japanese government. Not only did they lose their freedom, but they also, some found that their property and possessions had been sold off while they were away. And this leads to the idea that Asian Americans, because they're perpetual foreigners, they need to be overly patriotic to become American.
Next, I'll be introducing the model minority myth, including what the model minority myth is, how it connects to the Asian American community, how it emerged and developed, why is it a myth, and the consequences of this myth. The term model minority can mean any minority group that is successful in general. Now, this phrase is commonly used to refer to the Asian American community. Unfortunately, this idea is a myth, but that does not prevent the stereotype that all Asian Americans are rule-following, nerdy, and high-achieving, especially in education and finance, and that they earn their achievement through hard work and more talent. The idea of a model minority first appeared in an article written by sociologist William Peterson in the New York Times Magazine in 1966. In the article, Peterson discussed how Japanese Americans reach success despite discrimination. This term was then used in subsequent articles when referring to different Asian groups. A major factor that contributes to the formation of model minority groups is the restrictive immigration policies enacted by the US government. Specifically, immigrants who are smart, wealthy, or skilled in certain fields are more welcome in the US, and these advantages may help them to do well in their new environment. In addition to immigration policies, immigration experience also perpetuates the model minority myth. Many immigrants leave behind their properties, homeland, and relatives when moving to a new country, and there's a natural tendency to make that sacrifice worth it by trying harder. Many Asian people also reinforce the model minority myth through their cultural values. Because of family traditions and historically authoritarian governments, Asian people are accustomed to following the instructions of authorities. Also, a common belief among Asians is that hard work and education are life-changing. Many immigrants have experienced success through hard work, which may deepen this belief. On the other hand, some Asian people may feel prompted to work because their culture stresses effort to the point that being comfortable and not trying one's best may be seen as shameful. Despite all the seeming support for an Asian model minority, this concept is a myth because it ignores the diversity among individuals and cultures. There are numerous distinct populations that are all fall in the categories of Asian Americans, and viewing them only as Asian diminishes their unique characteristics. Moreover, because of the widespread popularity of the model minority myth, people often neglect the socioeconomic diversity within the Asian American community. As you can see in the graph, the percentage of Asian Americans who are uninsured, uneducated, or living below the poverty line are considerable within certain populations, and these percentages for Asians as a whole are still larger than that of Caucasian Americans. A further example of the inequality between Asian and Caucasian Americans is the percentage of Caucasians holding executive positions in business and politics, which is disproportionately high. So, even if there are a sizable number of wealthy Asian Americans, they're a relatively powerless population. Many Asians view the model minority myth as a recognition of their effort and achievement. However, it can indeed lead to certain harmful consequences. For instance, many people use the model minority myth to dispute the existence of racism against Asians. They claim that there is no way discrimination exists against this group because of the fact that some Asians are successful and have high status in society. The truth is, though, that it's common for Asian Americans to experience limitations in opportunities because of their race. There are accusations about Asians taking too much resources, and many Asians have to compete against each other as a result. The model minority myth can also induce mental health issues. The competition and expectations can generate a lot of pressures and anxiety. On the other hand, people are more likely to assume that Asian people are capable of overcoming obstacles and fail to recognize their struggles. Finally, this myth may undermine the relationship between Asians and other minority groups. The achievements of Asian Americans are often used to accuse other ethnic groups of not working hard, which might incur conflicts and even resentment between racial minority groups.
As a result of the model minority myth and other examples of racism in Asian American history, Asian Americans face unique traumas. Generally speaking, trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience that fundamentally transforms an individual. It's not limited to big events. They can be a series of small events, perhaps even unnoticeable at first to the victim. Trauma is also not homogeneous or uniform even within a specific region. One type of trauma that affects Asian Americans is transgenerational trauma, which is trauma that is passed down the generations. Another type is cultural trauma, which is an experience that causes a dramatic loss of identity and inhibits cultural identity. which is something that can anchor a person's sense of self. In response to trauma, humans develop defensive mechanisms, which include avoidance, attentive immobility, chronic immobility, withdrawal, aggressive defensiveness, and appeasement. Here we've summarized 5 major causes of trauma for Asian Americans. These don't apply to everyone, but they are common among the Asian American community. First, for immigrants, political unrest or other violent experiences from that person's home country can definitely cause trauma that follows them to the United States. This trauma might also be passed down to their children in the form of transgenerational trauma. In the United States, new trauma can arise for immigrants, like fear of losing loved ones back at their home country, the difficulty of leaving their home country and adjusting to a new land, difficulty maintaining cultural traditions, especially in communities without large populations of Asian Americans. The language barrier means that difficulty can arise with activities as simple as public transportation, doctor's appointments, or filling forms for government services, which can bring further obstacles to immigrants. As we discussed earlier, Asian Americans face lots of racism and violence, which are big causes of trauma. For Asian Americans who grow up in the United States, growing up feeling excluded by society is certainly very harmful and can lead to trauma and other mental health problems. Finally, a lack of support system and difficulty finding others with shared experiences causes loneliness and worsens mental health. There's a couple major reasons why Asian Americans face difficulty with mental health treatment. First, Western modality and Eastern modality for mental health treatment differs. Western medicine is different from Eastern medicines in that some Eastern medicines believe in the mind-body connection as the center of mental health treatment. Furthermore, many Western mental health professionals don't share the same cultural, ethnic, or linguistic background as their Asian American patients, which can cause further disconnect from the doctor and the patient. Combined with poor translations of psychiatric labeling, which may be confusing even to those fluent or native in English, these cultural barriers lead to lack of understanding and unnecessary confusion for Asian Americans seeking mental health treatment. Second, lack of homogeneity among Asian Americans means that no single model fits all in terms of mental health treatment. In fact, the Asian population in the United States has more than 43 ethnic groups, and speaking over 100 languages and dialects. Hence, a deep understanding of various Asian ethnic groups is necessary in order to make mental health treatment for all Asian Americans more effective. Third, there's stigma surrounding Asian Americans with mental health problems, which makes it difficult for Asian Americans to acknowledge their mental health problems in the first place, and furthermore, to seek mental health treatment. Because Asians are perceived to have fewer mental health problems, partially because of the model minority myth, the stigma is only worsened. Finally, the very nature of a person's traumatic incident may disable them from speaking about their mental health, which is crucial in mental health treatment.
In a national report from the organization Stop AAPI Hate, 68.1% of hate incidents reported against Asian Americans over the past year involved verbal assault, 20.5% involved avoidance, and 11.1% were physical attacks. 1,226 hate incidents have occurred in California over the past year, with 708 reported in the Bay Area alone. Elderly Asian Americans have been the biggest target in the recent wave of attacks, prompting discussions of their specific vulnerability. The conflation of heritage and nationality manifests in two distinct ways about the discourse in the rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans. On one hand, it's used to pin Asian Americans as a scapegoat for the pandemic with terms such as Chinese virus or Kung flu, but on the other hand, some blame tense US-China relationships for the rise in hate crimes. It's important to note that both scenarios rely on the perpetual foreigner stereotype. Especially after the shootings in Atlanta last month, students or parents might have heightened fears about becoming a victim of a hate incident. We have suggestions on how to hold discussions on this topic in the next slide.
One thing we can do is to keep ourselves informed by looking into related news, the history of Asian Americans, and other articles. It's also important to discuss with others, especially those belonging to another ethnic groups, to exchange ideas and spread awareness.
Another thing we can do is destigmatize mental health through conversations. These conversations are partly so that we can spread awareness of what mental health for Asian Americans looks like in contrast to the model minority myth. Through open conversations, we can also validate each other's mental health issues and make each other feel comfortable about conversations about our own struggles with mental health. Similarly, we need to affirm each other's experiences with racism. This applies especially to microaggressions, which are often overlooked and dismissed. A microaggression is an indirect or subtle discrimination against members of a certain group like Asian Americans. Microaggressions towards Asian Americans takes many forms, including an assumption of excelling in STEM or playing a musical instrument, imitating an Asian accent, or believing that all Asian parents are tiger parents. The model minority myth and other stereotypes around Asian Americans are also examples of microaggressions.
Saturday to come to our presentations. My name is Johnny Brera. I'm one of the co-advisors here at BayEcho, and working with these students is such an honor. Thank you all for taking time out of your day and for these past couple of weeks to spend time with us and to participate in these events. These students have worked so hard these past few weeks, and I think that they all really deserve a hand. So if you guys can unmute or, just clap on your own, or maybe even send a reaction. Oh, yeah, so if we can send a reaction, that would be great. These students have worked very hard, and these conversations just need to be had. For the next portion of this event, I want to invite everyone to participate in some Q&A. And if you have any questions at all, please ask them in the chat or raise your hand with the reaction buttons. Yeah, so let's start this Q&A.
I think one of the questions, I'm gonna reword it a little bit, that we did receive in the registration was, how can you recognize mental health versus just typical behavior, especially in, like in a teenage Asian male or a teenage Asian guy. And so I know that all of our speakers today um, are all, young women. So I don't know if you know how you might be able to answer that. We also have a BayEcho alumni joining us today. So I will also stretch that question out to you, Sherwin, if you um, are open to. I know I just put you on the spot. Um, but yeah, so like, how do you tell between just typical behavior in, Asian American teenagers versus mental health symptoms? I'm gonna enable unmuting.
Yeah, I can try to answer that. It's really hard because everyone presents the symptoms of having poor mental health differently, right? Some people tend to withdraw in on themselves and don't talk about their problems to others. Some of them can like display their problems as like a call for help. Um, I know personally for me, I did a little bit of both. In high school, had um, I had pretty poor mental health, but what I ended up the way I ended up getting out of that was um, being more open about it and reaching out to people and just being honest with how I was feeling, um, telling close friends, telling responsible adults. Um, and that was really the help I needed. The other big thing was also getting into better environments. High school was not a very good environment. It was very stressful. I went to Monte Vista High School, so um, and I'm sure some of you here are also Monte Vista students or alums. Um, but after going to college, I went to, I'm going to, well, going to, I'm, online school right now. But I go to Occidental College, which is a very happy campus. Um, and I was surrounded by really supportive people, given really the room to explore what I wanted to do. Um, my relationship with my family improved a lot. And now that I've been living at home for a year, I feel uh, a lot closer to them. And I think that was also another part that helped my mental health was being open to family, right? Because being family is like who I spend the most time with during quarantine every day. Um, right now it's just me and my mom, but um, being really open and honest about how I was feeling, having both of us having our own space, um, and really healthy communication is really helpful to that. Sorry, that I just went on like a tangent after tangent, but hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of the picture of a teenage Asian boy.
Thank you for sharing. Um, yeah, I think a lot of it is like sometimes, and this might go more for people who are not in, um, who are not really family, but a lot of times to strangers or outside, viewers, um, symptoms or traits of certain mental illnesses or differences in Asian Americans a lot of times are just written off as part of the model minority myth and are stereotypes of, oh, well, they're just, quiet because they they're Asian and Asians are very quiet people, right? So a lot of times we kind of just think, oh, well, I think they're just quiet because of who they are in terms of their ethnicity. But we have to remember that that's a very closed-minded way to think about it. It's very important to remember that, you know, we have to think outside of this box that we've not just ourselves, but other people put us in, and think outside of it. And I think, like Sherwin said, the important thing is to just um, keep be open to conversations. If you show that you're not open to conversation by, um, I think this was a lot of last week, so I don't know if any of our speakers from last week who are here want to chime in. You don't have to, but if you show someone that you're not open to the conversation by saying things like, "Oh, well, you're fine," like, you I don't think that you have these mental health issues because of this, and this, um, just saying things that are dismissive can be a really quick way to show someone that you are not someone to share about, mental health or open up to. So just remembering, be open, and displaying and modeling that you're open through your everyday words and your actions and being open yourself too as parents. I know that's quite difficult sometimes to be vulnerable, but that I think is a really key point to model that vulnerability. Yeah.
I'd like to add to that actually.
Yeah, sure.
Uh, in addition to talk more about vulnerability and opening up, what really helped me and my family uh, opening up to each other was talking about them and their childhoods and how they grew up, and really having the common understanding and knowing really who each other were as people, right? Was a big step in me feeling safer in telling them how I was feeling, what I needed from them. Um, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. I don't know if we have other thoughts from our speakers today. Yeah, I think it's not exclusive to the Asian American community that behavior um, can be disguised, right? Certain symptoms, behaviors that come out as symptoms, or symptoms that come out as behavior, um, they might be typical. Like this is true for, you know, typically for girls, girls who don't complain about things or keep quiet about certain things. So just generally, being open to the conversations and showing that. Yeah.
I actually have a question for the speakers.
Sure.
What would a world without discrimination against Asian Americans look like, especially um, speaking towards uh, like us in California?
I guess I can talk about this a little bit. Um, I think personally, one of the biggest stereotypes that I've been thinking about is like the perpetual foreigner stereotype, and whether or like the hyphenation of Asian American, and whether that detracts from being um, like or like truly American. So I guess in the lack of that scenario, it would just be I guess less conflict between heritage and nationality. So not necessarily like going outside and somebody saying racist things or like physically attacking you, but I think for me more of like not having internal conflict.
Could you repeat that
Um,
question? Sorry. Or I guess Alice, you can go too.
I'm just gonna add on a little bit to what Nicole said. I think another thing that would be different was like I've seen examples of how Asian Americans, especially younger children, tend to feel embarrassed about their Asian heritage. Like maybe they don't want to eat the Asian food that their parents made for them. And I think that if the discrimination and like the pressure that society places on these children is erased, then that type of like heartbreaking incidents wouldn't occur anymore.
Sherwin, could you repeat that question?
Yeah. What would a world without discrimination against Asian Americans look like, especially in California in our lives?
All right. That's what I thought it was, but I wasn't 100%. Thank you. Anybody else? Any of our other BayEcho members who didn't share today too can answer that if you'd like. Yeah, I think that one that for me as um, someone who grew up in the Silicon Valley, right? Like I grew up here in, well, there's people joining now. Uh, so I grew up in San Jose, West San Jose, and I went to Limerick High School. Um, it was almost 9 out of 10 people that you saw would be Asian. Um, and I didn't really think much of it. Like I knew that occasionally, if I went to places where there were white people would, maybe see me as different, but it wasn't really a truly, it wasn't like I never had an eye-opening experience until I went to college where it was the exact opposite statistics. It was very hard for me to find other Asians, and the other Asians that I did find were international, and they did not share my, you know, hyphenation identity as an Asian American. So because of that, you know, there were people constantly on campus who would, you know, be shocked at my English. My name, like on a class roster, is actually my Chinese legal name. So a lot of people, you know, they either assume because of my listed name that I am international and I don't speak English very well, um, which is weird. Or, you know, a lot of people would come up to me and ask me how I say my name, and just say very dismissive things that are usually with good intentions. And you know, saying things like, oh, like, are you Chinese? Because I love Chinese food. They're not trying to hurt me when they say that, and I know it, but it is hurtful because it's diminishing my identity, to their small perspective of um, what an Asian American is. And I think the biggest thing is that if there was no discrimination, I wouldn't feel like I had to explain myself, and I wouldn't, you know, be experiencing these microaggressions, where people just don't know um, about, you know, the Asian American diaspora, or about, you know, very basic common knowledge of Asians, and you know, treating us like, without having to say those kinds of um, really weird comments. Because, you know, if someone just went up to you and was like, "How do you say your name?" like, really is kind of weird. Especially when you teach them. I would teach them how to say my name, and they wouldn't do the exact pronunciation I told them, and it would just be especially disrespectful, since they are not, they pretend like they want to learn, but they're not willing to actually um, say it the way that I tell them to say it. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? I know some of you are just joining, but if you have questions or comments regarding our presentation, regarding relevant topics, or just generally comments but without questions, feel free to send that in the chat, or unmute yourself, or raise your hand, or if you have your own personal answers to any of these questions.
Is it okay if I ask another question?
Sure.
So I'm looking at the table that was earlier in the presentation about AAPI by the numbers. And I see there's a pretty wide spread regarding median household income and education. And I was wondering, um, and this is a controversial topic, uh, but like with regards to things like hiring by racial preference and uh, affirmative action, how helpful is it when the distribution within Asian American is so wide, right?
Yeah, I'll share that chart too.
So yeah, like even within Chinese, uh, the Chinese American population, uh, there there are extremes in less than high school education and those with bachelor's and higher, uh, and it's I think those should well, I don't want to inject my own opinion into my question, but what do you guys think about that in regards to affirmative action?
Right, I guess I can answer this. I know that like a recent example was Stanford has this thing called the Ideal Program, which is basically, I guess, like a form of affirmative action, but the way that it goes is they kind of group in Asian Americans with like white candidates. And I think like given the distribution of like the inherent diversity of Asian American, like it's covering a whole continent of, and also like people with such different experiences when they come to America. So I think just having that like binary division or like amalgamation of Asian American into, I think it plays into what we were talking about with the model minority myth. Like having that be the definition of Asian American, I think is like rather limiting when it comes to affirmative action.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I personally have a stance that is more that, you know, especially with college admissions, it doesn't take in, or they say they do, but it doesn't really take into consideration, you know, just people who didn't have the educational opportunities, whether that's just because of not having been able to um, afford it, or not having family who, you know, have degrees, right? Because I think it's like if your parents have a degree, then it's much, much more likely for you to get one. As opposed to if your parents don't have a degree, like post high school, it's far, or at least according to statistics, it's far less likely. And I think that's where, you know, programs like that don't really look at ethnicity statistics, like first generation programs, are very helpful. Um, and I think that that's more like common at non top tier schools, I think, than not. Um, but yeah, I definitely think that it's more important to have um, categorizations beyond just Asian, because there are so many cultures, and um, you know, even just looking at these statistics, it differs so wildly. um, and so yeah, but I think, I mean, in the real world, not in an ideal world, it's impossible to make up for the inequalities that exist, unfortunately. So I think the best things that we can do are to have small programs, like encouraging first generation students, encouraging students that grew up in, you know, areas where the schools were not good, or the schools were underfunded, and you know, since those programs where it's about that rather than about your ethnicity, um, I think look and reflect more accurately towards these statistics. Yeah. Oh, someone's just joining right now. Um, so we are coming close to wrapping up. And again, if you have any questions or comments, um, feel free to ask them. Um, but like I'll just have a closing statement real quick. So today we covered a lot about Asian American history. Our lovely teenagers did a great job of, you know, sharing about history that isn't necessarily shared in textbooks, right? The establishment of the term Asian American, and, you know, just historical um, bits like the Chinese American immigrants that came long ago, but you know, at least I personally don't know any Chinese people who have that heritage. Um, and then, you know, we had um, someone sharing about the model minority myth and why it's not necessarily a good thing um, to be called smart just because we're Asian, and it's not really good. It's not necessarily good to have that labeling as saying that we succeed because we're Asian. Um, while on the surface level, that is a good comment. And then, you know, traumas and mental health issues that we face as an Asian American community because of um, cross generational, cross cultural experiences that make a really big impact on our lives, and also just the stigma that exists within the Asian community. And I think um, it's really big that, you know, you all are here today to join in this conversation. So I hope that beyond today, like as we shared earlier, you have these conversations and you continue to look into articles, go to events like these, where people talk about Asian American history and statistics and mental health and all of these things. And that you have these conversations with your families too and your friends. And yeah, so hopefully, you know, you were able to take something away. This is a little bit of a different seminar than we usually have, where instead of talking directly about, you know, communication within your homes between parents and teenagers, we're talking about a really big topic. So thank you for joining us. I'm still having people join us. Um, Thank you so much for joining us. We'll stick around for a while if you still do have questions. I will close the meeting for everybody so that BayEcho can have can do our normal meeting. But yeah, so if you have any other questions, feel free to stick around and ask them, put them in the chat if you feel a little bit more comfortable just asking them one-on-one. But yeah, other than that, thank you so much for coming.